In light of Darcy's sudden going into labor, there is a shift in our sermon series today, and Scott is going to be preaching from Daniel. So I want to invite you to stand in honor of God's written word. We're going to be today in Daniel 1 through 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Well, good morning. This is an exciting day. We are in another new place to gather and worship together, and it is a joy. And I want to reiterate the thanks that we feel towards our deacons and our staff and a whole lot of other people who have made this all possible. They've done a ton of work, and we're here, and it's working, and we're celebrating the Lord together in a new place. So thank you to all of you. We are very grateful for all the work you've put in. Well, as Tony said, I am not Craig, and we're not finishing Nehemiah today. A funny thing happened on the way to bed last night for me. I got a phone call asking if I could fill in for Craig. And part of that solution was not me coming up with a brand new sermon on Nehemiah. So I am, as I decided what to preach on, the very first thing that I thought through was, what have I preached before but not here? So I did not start from scratch last night at 10:30. So this passage in Daniel 1, A, was something I'd preached before. B, it fits the general timeline of where we have been in Israel's history as we've gone through Ezra and Nehemiah. So you do have some of the context already in your head. And the third reason I chose it, and really this is one of the really significant ones, is that I think that the exile of Daniel and his friends, that in that exile we find for ourselves a very instructive model for how we should think about life. Exile is a huge theme in the scriptures. Over the course of Ezra and Nehemiah, we have been seeing the Babylonian exile of Israel come to an end. But this is only the proverbial tip of the iceberg in terms of the theme of exile in the scriptures. On the very first pages of Genesis, Adam and Eve live in this garden home that God made for them on the condition that they trust and obey God. They don't, and they are exiled from the garden. In Genesis 3, 23 to 24, we read this. The Lord God sent them out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. No longer allowed to re-enter their garden home due to armed guards, Adam and Eve are now left to build a life for themselves outside of what had been their home. One chapter later, in Genesis 4, Adam and Eve's son, Cain, murders his brother Abel. And after his murder of Abel, Cain is exiled. Genesis 4, 12 and 16 say this, "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Again, we see this concept of exile. Cain is exiled away from his family. Jump forward about 8 more chapters to Genesis 12, and Abraham is called to leave his home and go to a new place. And the book of Hebrews describes that calling this way. This is in Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of that same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that had foundations, whose designer and builder is God. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles in the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. For God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Even though there's this land that he's taking them to be their home, they have a longing for a future home, a permanent home. You can think of the 400 years in Egypt as a form of exile, or the 40 years of wandering before they entered the promised land as another exile. The Babylonian captivity that we've been seeing in Ezra and Nehemiah is certainly the most famous of the exiles. But as we've seen in Ezra and Nehemiah, when they go back, everything isn't great. They're home, but they're not really home. I'm going to jump way forward in the story because I actually do want to talk about Daniel chapter 1 and go into the New Testament. Listen to how Peter addresses his Christian readers in 1 Peter 1 and 2. To those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with his blood. Peter addresses these Christians as elect exiles. I want to propose to you that the best way to conceptualize yourself as you live in this world is to think of yourself as an exile. We are not at home. This is not where we belong. Someday we will get to where we belong. This isn't forever. God will remake heaven and earth, and heaven will literally come to earth, and we will be home forever. Exile will be over. But we long for that day because we're not there yet. That's why I think the lives of Daniel and his friends living in Babylon hold incredible relevance to us today. What does it mean to be an exile? How do you live as an exile? Because if we are exiles today, and I'm convinced we are, we need to know how to live that way. And I think Daniel chapter 1 is a great start to thinking about how do we live as exiles. So let me back up a little bit of history to lead into Daniel 1, even though we've been in this kind of era of Israel's history. Let me just give us a refresher of where we're at. About 900 years before Jesus' birth, the nation of Israel divides into two separate kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Israel very quickly stops following God. And after about 200 years of their independence, they were conquered. Judah, the kingdom to the south, they fared just a little bit better. Occasionally they have a good king who helped them get back on track and following God, but time and again they abandoned God just like Israel had. And after surviving about 100 more years, Judah was then attacked and defeated by the nation of Babylon. So as was common at that time, when the Babylonians conquered a new nation, they would take the best of the wealth and the resources of that conquered nation and that's what we have in the exile. And that's the story that Tony read for us a few minutes ago. We find Nebuchadnezzar conquering Judah and taking all of her best stuff. And not only the treasures from the temple, but also the best of her people. And that might not be the first thing that we think about, but Nebuchadnezzar knew that the best and the brightest people from a conquered nation may be the more valuable thing to bring home than even the gold and silver that they could carry away in their hands. But there's a challenge with taking the best and the brightest from a conquered country, and that's getting those people to be on your side. How do you convince a defeated enemy to join your side and work for you? The Babylonians had an answer to that, and that was this whole assimilation campaign. Give them Babylonian names, teach them Babylonian language, have them read Babylonian literature, have them eat the king's food. Basically, train them up to be Babylonians for 3 years. At the end of that time, give them an ACT test and see how they do. And keep the ones that do well. But, as Tony read at the end of his passage, in verse 8, Daniel has a serious problem with that plan. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And that might strike us as odd, but we need to remember some background. There are a whole set of rules in the Old Testament that describe the food that Jewish men and women were allowed to eat, how those foods needed to be prepared. Those rules collectively today, we call them kosher rules. They include things like not eating pork and shellfish and birds and a whole lot of other things. Those would definitely not have been followed by the cooks in Babylon. Now remember that Daniel was a young man, probably somewhere between 14 and 17. If you're between 14 and 17, raise your hand. There's a few of you in here. That's who's here. These are 14 to 17-year-old young men. They've been separated from their parents. They've been taken from their country. They've been taken from everything they know. Imagine yourself, like those that just raised their hand, maybe a freshman in high school. America has been defeated and destroyed. It doesn't even exist anymore. And you've been taken captive off to another country, the country that defeated you. You've been put in an elite boarding school. Everything you've ever known has been taken away from you, even your name. Perhaps that gives you an inkling of how Daniel might have been feeling. How easy it would have been to just go with the flow. Don't stick your neck out. Play it safe. It would have been so easy to just eat the food that they were given. It wasn't like there was a kosher deli around the corner where they could go and get their food. What are they going to eat? Would they even be allowed to not eat the food they were given? This is why I love Daniel. He resolved not to defile himself. In other words, he firmly decided not to eat the food that he was being offered. He didn't have a plan B worked out yet. He didn't have approvals from the right people. He didn't have an alternate food source. But he and his friends drew a line in the sand and just said, no. Somehow or other, that's not what we're going to do. Now at that point, they're faced with, what do we do? How do we pull this off? How to communicate that no to your captors. I can think of at least 4 ways that they might have approached this. 1, forcefully, belligerently refuse to eat the food that you're being given. 2, fast for a really long time until they give you something else. 3, start a food fight at every meal and just hope no one notices that you're not eating the food. 4, figure out some way to get permission to have some special food. Okay, they probably didn't think of the food fight idea. That gives you a little window into my brain. They chose option 4. They tried to cut a deal in a respectful way. So I'm going to read some more of our story, picking up in verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. The chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. So after Daniel's initial respectful request, the official refuses out of fear for his job and apparently for his life. Well, instead of giving up and saying, well, I guess we tried, they come back with another offer. Give us a trial period, 10 days, and then look and see how we are doing compared to everyone else. The official thinks about that and he's like, that's pretty reasonable. You can't look that bad after 10 days. And he's kind of assuming, yeah, and then I'll have to put you back on the regular food. Let's go back to the text and see how it turns out. Picking up in verse 15. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and their wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. In other words, the test goes really, really well. And not only did God sustain them physically on a diet made for a rabbit, God grew them into the best of all of the Babylonian kingdom. They grew to be learned and wise. Now, a lot of us might already know this story, and it doesn't surprise us how it turns out. But you got to remember, Daniel doesn't know the end of the story when he makes this decision to not defile himself. He doesn't know that's how it's going to turn out. He's just a kid who wants to honor God. But what did he know? What enabled Daniel to stand firm in the face of such difficult circumstances? Probably a lot of things, for sure. But I think that one of the most important things that Daniel knew is that God was in control. You see, the prevailing thought in the ancient Near East was this concept of local deities. People believed that gods were tied to places. The god of Babylon had power in Babylon. The god of Assyria ruled only in Assyria. But Daniel and his friends knew that God was God, God of the whole world, not just Jerusalem. They knew that he was in control everywhere. Even though the headlines would have all been declaring that the Babylonian god had defeated their god, and external circumstances would have certainly made that narrative look true. But they knew that despite the circumstances, that God was really God. He was in control. So they could take the risk of eating only vegetables. Notice, too, that they don't reject everything that Babylon presents. They take on Babylonian names. They wear Babylonian clothes. They take Babylonian jobs, jobs that are truly going to help Babylon succeed. So it's not like they're constant rebels in Babylon, just saying no to everything. They chose things. They said, no, this goes over the line. This is too far. And then what we have in the book of Daniel is a highlight reel of some of those times when they said, no, that's crossing the line. We can't do that. Now, obviously, we don't have a king trying to force us to eat pork. And even if we did, I like bacon. Generally makes every meal better. So it wouldn't be a problem. We don't have the dietary restrictions that the Jews had. But we do still live as exiles. And we live in a culture that is pushing us to violate biblical commands all the time. Daniel provides a great model for us to not bow to the culture, but instead to start out by resolving not to defile ourselves, and then seeking a tactful resolution where possible so that we can maintain our integrity and honor God. We want to take a tactful stand when the stream of culture, or our friends, or our family, pushes us towards things that wouldn't honor God. It pushes us towards being disrespectful towards authorities. When it pushes us towards greed, or towards abusing alcohol. When it pushes us to lie or cheat, to get or stay ahead. A big one in our culture today would be agreeing with sexual norms that violate the scriptures. Some of these things might require us to take a more obvious stand than others. Some will just require us to choose to live differently than the world around us. And in doing so, we may stand out. And we may be a cultural outsider. Same thing that helped Daniel stand firm is the same thing that will enable us to stand firm. God is in control. Now we're in a college town, so I'm going to take cheating as an example. Cheating in college is rampant. In a recent survey of 300 college students, 86% admitted to having cheated in school. More than half, 54%, indicated that cheating was actually okay. Some said it was just necessary to stay competitive. And 97% of the people who admitted to cheating said that they'd never been caught. Sorry if you were a teacher, that's probably a pretty depressing set of numbers to hear. But if you were a student, and that's the reality around you, it might feel like you're putting yourself at a massive competitive disadvantage to not cheat. And to be honest, you are. Cheating raises the curve, and if you don't raise your score as well, then that'll hurt your grade. Okay, so that's reality, but you have two options. You cheat, or you don't cheat. If you choose not to cheat, you're really saying that your integrity and your walk with God are worth more to you than the extra points that you might score if you cheated. Friends, that is way easier to do if you believe that God is in control. If God is in control, then I can rely on Him for justice. I can rely on Him to keep His plans for me alive. Every student has gone through this thought process. If I bomb this test, I bomb this class. If I bomb this class, it'll kill my GPA. If I kill my GPA, I won't get into grad school. If I don't get into that grad program, I won't get a good job. And if I don't get that good job, I'll die penniless and alone and no one will ever love me. Well, maybe not everybody thinks that last part, or at least not that dramatically, but that's the thought process, right? But if we believe that God is in control, we can confidently say that it will be okay. God's plans for my life will not be thwarted by my obeying Him. If I have a slightly lower GPA because I actually earned every point without cheating, God will still be able to get me into the job He wants me to be in. God is in control. That temptation to cut corners, to lie, and to cheat, to get or to stay ahead, doesn't end after graduation. Most of you in the room are not currently students, but you're still faced with those temptations. Maybe it comes when you fill out an expense report or your tax return, or when you're trying to decide if you're going to stream something legally or illegally. But to take one step away from this notion of cheating and lying, there may be a day coming in America when it becomes illegal to express or even to hold a biblical view on sexuality. If that day comes, will you go with the culture and let go of the Bible, or will you hold on to the Bible and stand against the culture? God is in control. And we can have confidence to stand with him, even if it means standing against our culture, even if it means standing against your friends, even if it means standing against your family, even if it means losing status or losing income. Don't know what's coming. We live as exiles. This is not our home. This culture will always be pushing us away from obedience, and we have to stand. I'm really glad that Daniel chose not to defile himself. It's both a reminder and a model to me of living wholeheartedly for God, standing firm when the culture around you demands that you obey it rather than obeying God. At the end of the day, I have defiled myself. I have blown it. And so have you. Though I could make the right choice to obey God, I don't always do it. And though our text doesn't show it today, Daniel wasn't perfect either. There's only been one perfect person who fully resolved not to defile himself. Jesus stepped out of heaven and into our exile, and he was surrounded by temptation, just like Daniel was thousands of years ago and just like we are today. But he resolved not to defile himself, and he succeeded every single time. He went to the cross as the only perfect human. He died there, having never given in to sin, and he offers that perfection for us in place of our defiled life. That's the ultimately really good news from the book of Daniel. Though I am defiled, I have one who never was and offers me his perfection. And through faith in him, I can grow into the kind of man who can stand firm even when the whole world around me is abandoning him. Daniel is heroic in the story, but Jesus is our hero. You are an exile. This is not your home. This world will never be as comfortable and easy as we want it to be until God makes it anew. Until then, stand firm, trusting the one who is in control and who made himself an exile for you so that he could bring you home in the end. Let me pray. God, thank you. Thank you so much. You're real, that you're in control, that we can stand on that. We're not standing on Daniel, we're not standing on ourselves, we're not standing on our resolve, we're standing on you. God, help us. Help us to make the right choices. Help us to stand firm in the face of a culture that wants to push us further and further away from you. We need you. In Jesus' name.